I volunteer at a food bank, and my job's usually pretty simple. I show up and bring people food. And one day, one of my coworkers asked me to help her with one of our usual customers. So I went through the usual steps. I took down his name, put it in the system, got his box of food, and brought it to him. And then he said, no, you misunderstand. I came here to find a wife for my son. So I looked at him absolutely dumbfounded and said, sir, this is a food bank. But he just stood there, as if my words were the ones that didn't make sense, and I repeated, sir, this is a food bank. And then he asked to speak to my manager. So, believe it or not, this type of interaction is not entirely uncommon for me. I run a nonprofit called Healing Helpers that offers translation services to Muslim refugees in need. We go around the Phoenix Valley to events like food banks, health clinics, and anywhere else for refugees that need help, and we translate for them. You see, a lot of Muslim refugees that come to America speak little to no English, and because of that, at least in part, struggle to find jobs that pay living wages, even more so than other refugees. According to data from the US Census Bureau, according to data from the US Census Bureau, Iraqi and Somali refugees have the highest rates of low income among refugees, with nearly 3/4 of them considered low income. These countries are also predominantly Muslim. And despite what you might initially think, this discrepancy between Muslim refugees and all other refugees doesn't just have to do with a discrepancy in English proficiency on arrival. Liberia, a country with an official language of English, sits at the middle of the pack with 62% of refugees considered low income. And refugees from Russia, a country where only 7% of refugees coming reported speaking some English, have a low income rate of 32%, which compares favorably to the 33% rate of US-born natives. Now, you might be tempted to think that differences in education among refugees can explain the differences in outcome. And while there certainly is some correlation, I think it's instructive to compare Vietnamese and Iraqi refugees. Because while the differences in outcome are clear, the differences in education are not. Iraqi and Vietnamese refugees have fairly similar rates of education across the board, although Iraqis actually have slightly higher rates of post-secondary education, yet on average, Vietnamese refugees far outperform their Iraqi counterparts. I mean, it's not even close. So, what gives? Why are Muslim refugees struggling to get by more than others in America? Well, as it turns out, an even better indicator of refugee financial success than education is length of residence. This is a graph comparing refugee median income with length of residence. As you can see, the refugees that have been here the longest make the most money. At first, life is pretty rough for refugees, which is especially apparent in the first 5 years, which has the average refugee making just 40% of median income. But as time goes on, refugees are able to assimilate. This graph explains the trend of Vietnamese refugees doing well in America, because they've generally been here for longer. It also explains the trend of Muslim refugees struggling more in America, because they're generally coming from countries that have become war-torn in the recent past. And so, while English speaking is certainly a portion of the struggle, coming to America with knowledge of English doesn't solve all the problems a refugee has. Evidently, some things can only be learned with time in a country. And I don't mean to discount the numerous difficulties caused by not speaking English in America. But today I'd like to highlight some of the more subtle difficulties, some of the life-altering complications that refugees face that go little mentioned. And to start us off, I would like to draw your attention to Shibboleths, a long-standing customer tradition, often unspoken, that distinguishes one group of people from another. So, Shibboleths can be anything, from how you marry off your son to how you pronounce a word. In fact, the origin story of this word is about pronunciation. After a major battle, the refugees who could successfully pronounce Shibboleth were allowed to go free, and those who couldn't were executed. Perhaps the consequences aren't as drastic these days, but Shibboleths describe one of the major problems that refugees face in any new country. However much knowledge refugees might think they have of the US's customs and cultures, there are 1,000 little unspoken rules to trip them up at every corner. So, going back to the story of how I was asked to pull out a wife from somewhere in the back of a food bank, The issue in this encounter wasn't caused by a language barrier. I could understand a refugee perfectly, but it was caused by a difference in culture, a shibboleth, if you will. You see, the culture around marriage in the Middle East is drastically different from that in the US. In the Middle East, your parents go around asking their family, friends, and acquaintances if they know anyone looking for a spouse. And in America, you do pretty much anything but that. So what is the result of this difference in culture? That refugee can't get his son married. I mean, he's coming to a food bank he frequents to look for a wife for his son. Presumably, he's exhausted his other options and he's coming to the food bank because he doesn't know how else to help his son. That is a life-altering complication. And there are tons of these subtle differences in culture that people don't even realize are there. Differences in the job market, education system, just everyday life that make living in America that much more difficult for refugees. And when compounded with not being able to speak the language, these issues can feel insurmountable. And yet, on top of all these issues, refugees are often treated with indignity. And whenever I think about this topic, one specific encounter I have always comes to mind. It was the beginning of the pandemic, and fear was at an all-time high. I showed up for my shift at one of the food banks, and I came into the scene of multiple volunteers shouting at an Iraqi refugee. They couldn't speak Arabic, and he couldn't understand English. He didn't realize that the procedures had changed, and he was supposed to wait in his car for his food to be delivered. I cleared the misunderstanding in under a minute. Now, of course, the volunteers had an intent. I mean, they were only volunteering because they intended to help the man. But still, it's rather undignifying when you flee your home country out of fear for your life and come to America, where you struggle to live because you don't understand the language and the customs and cultures in place. And then, when you seek help, you get met with frustration because of the very problems that caused you to need help in the first place. It's because of my experiences with the indignities of refugees that I decided to found Healing Helpers. We've been able to help over 6,000 refugees by translating for them when it matters. But we do more than just translation. We've been able to help them integrate into the American lifestyle by helping them with things like voter registration and census fulfillment, and by explaining some of the shibboleths present in American culture. And the difference we're making was really evident to me when I was pulled aside at one of the events we were working at and told by a refugee family, "You know, Mostafa, if it weren't for you, we wouldn't come here." Of course, there are still some things that we can't do. If you come to one of our food banks looking for a wife for your son, I can't help you. It's against our policy. Thank you.